So I'm going to talk about taxation and suppliers network. The context is West Bengal. I have been working on this area almost 3 years now, and we have a complete paper. And the paper looks at the effect of taxation on the formation of production network and the effect of production network on the choice of tax policies or tax scheme. So in the complete paper, we have a model with monopolistic competition where you have the upstream firm, downstream firm. They have two choice variable. One is the tax scheme they want to be, and second is the choice of trading partner. And in equilibrium, we observe partial market segmentation and complementarity in tax choices. And we take that model to data from West Bengal, the tax data, and we use a tax policy change in 2014-15 to derive causal effect of tax policy on supply chain network. Okay, that's the kind of 3/4 of my paper. The other 1/4 is what I'm going to present here. Okay, so you can call that descriptive analysis. All I would show are kind of few graphs, and I will try to convince you or make my point with those graphs. So, tax policy in developing countries. We know that tax policy formulation in developing country often done with two objectives. One is the production revenue efficiency, which is very important, but at the same time we want to make sure that the production efficiency is not compromised. Now, these two objectives are often in conflict, and it's kind of established fact that VAT, value-added tax, I'll call it VAT all the time. VAT performs better than any other tax instrument when you have these two conflicting objectives. Now, how VAT works in a high evasion context, we don't know much about that. Okay, so there is also this concern that regulation or tax policy can give a distorted incentive to firms to remain small, to be more labor intensive, resulting in lower total factory productivity and obvious implication for the economic growth. Let me set the context how VAT works. Think of two types of firms. The upstream firm, you call them supplier, and the downstream firm who are clients. So it's a buyer-seller relation, and the tax liability in a VAT system is simply this formula. It's sales minus purchases multiplied by the tax rate. Okay, there is simplification here. This tax rate can be different. You can have one tax rate for sales, another tax rate for purchases, but I have used the simplified version. So this part is actually called value added. So you pay the tax on value added. Okay. Two things are why this is attractive. There are two reasons. It ensures production efficiency. You can see that the tax paid on purchases or on your inputs are deducted from your tax liability. So in other sense, you don't pay tax on inputs. So it should not affect your production decision. It should not distort your production decision. The second part is again interesting because of this negative sign, that tax paid on purchases or inputs reduces your tax liability. It reduces your tax liability when you purchase the inputs from another tax paying firms. So if you want to reduce tax liability, if you want to get refund of the tax you paid on your inputs, you have to make sure that you bought the inputs from another tax-paying firms. So firms will have an incentive to trade with another tax-paying firm. So that generates the tax multiplier effect. Now, very nice thing about VAT, but it requires that when this part T multiplied by purchases is called input tax credit. Very important incentive instrument in a VAT system. Now, this input tax credit is allowed only when the transaction is reported by both the trading partners. So it is reported by the buyer, it is reported by the seller, and that can be verified by a third party we call the tax authority. Okay, so it requires a lot of account keeping. Actually, you have to keep record of every transaction you make. Now, this constitute to the compliance cost, which can be quite high for small firms. So often VAT is combined with the simplified version tax instrument, which we call the turnover tax. What is that? I will explain that in the next slide. So my context is West Bengal. As you know, VAT was in place in West Bengal, for that matter, in whole country until 1st July 2017. After that, we have the GST. I will explain what is the difference between VAT and GST. So state government levied VAT on all sales of non-agricultural goods. So virtually on most of the things, except food grains and etc. And the simplified version, so for this VAT scheme, it was this formula, sales minus purchases multiplied by the tax. That's the tax liability. For small firms, which are defined by this threshold value, 15 lakh, they had a turnover scheme where the tax rate is 0.25%. Note it's not 25%, it's 0.25%, so very little tax. But it is on the turnover, not only on VAT, or not only on value added. Now, so a firm that whose turnover is less than 50 lakh, you're familiar with 50 lakh, right? Yeah, it's 5 million. So if a firm has a turnover less than 50 lakh, it can choose between those two. It can go for VAT scheme, it can go for turnover scheme. But if the turnover is more than 50 lakh, it has to be in VAT scheme. There is no choice in that point. Now, it comes with the qualification that purchases from turnover firms are not eligible for input tax credit. So if you purchase from a turnover firm, I would call turnover scheme firms turnover firm. If you purchase from them, you cannot claim input tax credit. So there are, in my data set, I use data from 2010-11 to 2016-17. There are annually 1,80,000 firms. Most of them are very small, you will see in the next slide. And this is the map of West Bengal. As you can see, these firms are scattered everywhere. We observe basically one big cluster here. This is Calcutta and the industrial district Howrah. Okay. Then you have one cluster here in Asansol and Chittaranjan, which is kind of a dying industrial district now. And then you have a little bit in Siliguri. High concentration is in Calcutta, Howrah, and Uttar Chobbish Pargana. These three districts. And this is where you see the share of turnover and VAT firms in different places. So if the color is close to, if the intensity of green is high, then you have almost 100% VAT firms. If it is close to red or pink, then it is like around 60% turnover firms. So 40% will be, 60% VAT firms, so 40% will be turnover firms. And again, as you can see in big cities, most of the firms are VAT firms. The turnover firms or 40% turnover firm cases are always in small cities or town, you can say. Now, this is the distribution of turnover of firms in different years. I would have two more kind of, pictures here. So, as you can see, most of the firms are very small. Okay. It has been cut here, but there are firms also here. I mean, but very few big firms. Most of the firms are very small. So what we observe here is, so this is the 50 lakh mark, right? So most of the firms have turnover less than 50 lakh. But interesting part is 73% of the firms with the option to be in turnover scheme actually decide to be in VAT scheme. So it shows that this input tax credit incentive is quite strong, okay, or at least for 70% firm. On the other hand, what I observed that in each year around this 50 lakh mark, there is a bunching just below the 50 mark. What is that? That would say, let me tell you the story. So suppose you are a turnover firm and your turnover increases, let's say from 1 lakh to 50 lakh. With your when your turnover increases, your tax liability increases at the rate of 0.25%. Now, when you are close to 50 lakh, you have to go to a VAT scheme, right, where the standard rate is 7%. So there will be a discontinuous jump in your tax liability. So you would have an incentive to underreport or remain below 50 lakh, so that you avoid this discontinuous jump in marginal tax revenue, right? So that's what we observed, that there is bunching below 50 lakh mark. That would mean that some firms who have turnover more than 50 lakh actually report below 50 lakh just to be in the turnover scheme. Is this clear? Now, so evidently this is a even incentive, right? So this bunching happens because some firms are underreporting their turnover just to be in the turnover scheme or reduce that. But that may not be the case. There are cases where firms actually adjust their production scale to remain in the turnover scheme. So there are two distinct incentives. One is evasion incentive, that if you can underreport, you remain in the turnover. Another is I am an honest taxpayer. My optimal kind of production scale will be 55 lakh, but I don't want to be in the VAT scheme, so I produce less. I produce 49. So that's not evasion. That's kind of adjusting the scale of operation or scale of business. So we really don't know what is more kind of what is stronger in this case, but I'm sure there is a story over there. We are not working exactly on this, we are working in a related thing, but one can kind of think of a model to identify which one is a stronger incentive, evasion or adjustment of the production. So as I said, we have 1,80,000 firms in every year and around 40 lakh annual transaction between them. So you can imagine it's a huge network with 1,80,000 notes and 40 lakh transaction between them. So it creates a huge network which I am not able to analyze. Only one would do justice to that. So what I am using here is I am using kind of the first order links, okay, not even the second order. So first thing I do is this transaction data. I have the information about the location of these firms. So I look at the distance between the trading partners in any transaction. Okay. So in this axis you have the percentage of transaction that happen within a particular distance on the horizontal axis. So what we observe that 80% of the transactions between two VAT firms actually happens within 50 kilometers. So it's really a localized transaction. 80% of transaction is happening within 50 kilometers. 50 kilometers radius will be a district, I guess. Okay. So very localized transaction. There are, distance transaction, but very few. So most of the transactions are localized. We use this information to answer this question. So first thing we want to look at is whether the firms that trade among themselves tend to have same tax scheme. Two tax scheme we are talking about. Another one is VAT, another is turnover. We want to see that the firms that trade among themselves, whether they adopt the same tax scheme, whether if one is VAT, other is likely to be VAT as well. So using that information, that transactions are very localized, we take the new firms that enter in my data set and predict their potential sales in the next period on the basis of location, the kind of goods they produce, and the tax status of other firms in the locality. And this is what we get. This is the turnover distribution of the firms that are likely to have very high share of their sales going to VAT firm. And this is the likely turnover distribution of the firms. They are likely to have very low sales to VAT firms. Now, as you can see that in this case, the bunching around this 50 lakh is very evident. So what it means that I, as a new entrant in the market, and I have a choice to choose between two tax schemes, VAT scheme and turnover scheme, If I see that I'm going to sell most of my goods to other VAT paying firms, I'll be somewhere here. So there's not significant incentive to do the bunching. But if I see that most of my sales are going to non-VAT firm, then I have less incentive to be the VAT scheme. So I might be one of this guy here. Okay, so I would bunch just below the 50 lakh mark, not to be in the VAT scheme. Second thing we do is another interesting thing that we observe that every year, like 14,000 firms, new firms enter into the tax scheme, and 14% of them disappear in the next period. So it's a very interesting, turnover, entry-exit thing, and this continues in the second year. It becomes 74%. From here, almost like how many? Almost 4,000 have disappeared in 2 years. What we try to do is we try to see whether this exit or entry or exit from VAT scheme or from the market is related to the trade network. What I mean, if I have a important supplier, whether if that fact has any effect on my probability of going out of the market in the next period. So as I said, I cannot do justice to this big network. So what I do a very simplified thing. I take 100 firms randomly. It's random. There are 100, all the red dots are new entrants. So you will have 100 red dots here and 100 red dots here. And this links with the blue ones is the first order link, not the second order, okay? So it's the friend's immediate friend, not friend's friend, okay? And what is the difference between these red dots and red dots here? These firms, red dots, they enter the market and they remain in the tax scheme in the next year. And these red dots, they enter the tax scheme and the next period they disappear from there. And evidently, these red dots are better connected to other firms than these red dots. Is that clear? Here we have a lot of red dots without any connection. So it seems that network connectivity really matters for survival in the tax system. Now, if you want to say that, okay, this is a new entrant, well connected, why it should disappear? Of course, this is the unconditional, probability of survival. So there are a lot of other factors. Maybe those factors are more important for this. Okay. So then we ask what happens to a firm when its suppliers move to from VAT scheme to turnover scheme. So this is the 2 minutes simple exercise we do. We are claiming that the kind of trade link I have with other firms is influential in determining my survival in the tax scheme or my choice of the tax scheme. We want to see that if what happens to me when my supplier actually changes his tax status from VAT to turnover. Now this is, I guess, the last graph. So we choose the data in such a way, we choose firms in 2012 that do not have any turnover client. So in this vertical axis, you have the share of turnover clients. So share of clients that belong to turnover scheme. We have chosen the data in such a way that in 2012, in the data set, there is none of the firms have any turnover clients. Okay, so it's 0 here. And these firms, some of them changes their scheme from VAT to turnover. So these red bars are the share of clients in turnover scheme for the firms who change the scheme from VAT to turnover. Okay, and the blue one is for the firms that remain in the VAT scheme. Now look at this, that in this period, these firms didn't have any turnover client. They move to turnover scheme next period, and they have a turnover share of turnover clients increases almost 30%. So is it that they entered the turnover scheme, all the turnover firms start trading with them? No. What we observe actually at this period, he had a lot of VAT clients and they change their tax policy. Is this clear? So they have all the 30% of the VAT client in this period actually moved to turnover scheme in the next period because he has changed his tax scheme from VAT to turnover. So there is kind of complementarity in the choice of tax scheme among the trading partners, and it's quite strong. So they can change the tax scheme, but they don't change their trading partner. Okay, so it's quite sticky. So that's what is my conclusion, that the firms with same tax status trade more, which can generate a multiplier, very good thing. But it also generates market segmentation. So what I mean by that the tax-paying firms will trade among themselves and non-tax-paying firms will trade among themselves. So there are likely to be less kind of interface between these two groups that will generate a segmentation. So for an optimal tax policy, these two, opposing effects needs to be rightly balanced. Okay. That's all. Thank you.
Have you done any study, I think, with the descriptive what you are mentioning on the actual products and the sub-products that have been part of the network?
Yes. So in this paper, we really focus on this, whether so there is a
tax part.
Yeah, and the other one, whether the bunching part, right? That's what it is.
What are the parts, the sub-parts, and then the whole cluster thing? I'm not like the industrial cluster, like what are the industrial clusters that are there? How is it developing? Because that is a prime
That's very much interesting for me. Like I really want to see whether the clusters in this data are formed by manufacturing of a particular good and how they are changing over time. That I would expect anyone to do at some point, okay? Because it's a it will be network analysis. So economists are not trained to kind of analyze network. Of course, not of this scale. Thank you.